Yeah, so again, the talks on December 14th, they really did sort of ease or calm tensions, but it really put it back to what it was pre the referendum. However, I don't think that we should downplay the sort of importance of those talks because the talks themselves established what is now known as the Joint Declaration of Argyle for Dialogue and Peace. And this is because important in those talks is the fact that Guyana and Venezuela both agreed that directly or indirectly, neither of them will threaten or use force against one another in any circumstances, including those consequential to any existing controversies between the two states. And to me, that was a firm denouncement of Western intervention, which, as I said in the beginning when we started this meeting, was what the major contradiction or the major invoking force for tensions between the two states were, this notion of Western intervention. And so importantly, this talk is saying that the threat of force and the use of force will not happen no matter what between the two states. And it was always the case that Venezuela was never going to actually use force against Guyana. Throughout the history of Venezuela claiming that this dispute on the border exists, Venezuela has always used aggressive nationalist rhetoric. And part of that aggressive nationalist rhetoric has seen Venezuela occupy some parts of what is considered Guyana's territory, and has also seen Venezuela move troops into Guyana's territory itself, but never actually declare war. And that is because of this notion of the region as a zone of peace, and also because even the sort of right-wing governments in Venezuela knew that Guyana's military is a very small military, and that if they ever were to engage in any sort of war or confrontation with Guyana, in the past, they would historically have to contend with Brazil. And Brazil saw itself as this sort of brother nation to Guyana, so that if Venezuela did have a, dispute on the borders, Brazil would have to intervene. And those three countries, Brazil, Venezuela, and Guyana, had agreed on their borders in the early 1900s. And so Venezuela always knew that confrontation with Guyana would bring in other regional members like Brazil and like Cuba that it did not want to have to confront. And in the present, I would say that because Venezuela views the United States as more of a military threat than it would of Brazil or Cuba, it still would not have ever made sense for Venezuela to use any force. And so this declaration about the threat of force and not using force is really just, again, an important step in Guyana, more or less denouncing the fact that it would have Western intervention being involved in any sort of regional conflict. And I do think that is very important. The declaration itself also reaffirms both states' stances as it regards the border. And so by this, I mean that Guyana, again, reaffirmed that it agrees with the United Nations Good Officers process that concluded in 2018, saying that if no resolution was reached, we are putting your case to UNSG, said we're putting your case to the ICJ. So Guyana, again, affirmed the Geneva Agreement process by saying that it respects the ICJ as the means or the ends of where the dispute should be settled, and Venezuela rejected it. And so neither state compromised their position in that regard. Here, I would also note that you had a lot of misinformation going about saying, oh, Venezuela just wants to go back to the Geneva Agreement. But Venezuela does not want to go back to the Geneva Agreement because per the Geneva Agreement, then Venezuela would be consenting to UN Article 33, which says that the dispute should be settled at the ICJ, given both Ban Ki-moon and the current Secretary Guterres saying that that is the case. However, what Venezuela has done is use the Geneva Agreement to say because the Geneva Agreement exists, then this border is in dispute. And so I do also want to clear that up in this. And so again, neither state changed its position. Venezuela just wants to keep the Geneva Agreement alive to say that a dispute exists, but it doesn't actually want to settle or close the dispute since it would not be in Venezuela's favor. The main goal of the meeting was to ease tensions, given the kinds of war and invasion and intervention rhetoric and talks that were floating around. And in my view, this had to happen because it also allowed both leaders, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and also Irfan Ali in Guyana, to more or less save face. because while Nicolas Maduro was being regarded as ridiculous to ignite this sort of border controversy that brings these two countries in a very hostile situation where Western intervention or the U.S. could get involved, Guyana was also saying very reckless things as well. Not necessarily Irfan Ali, but the vice president who has been the prime minister before, Jack Deo in particular, he was the one saying that Guyana would be welcoming to a U.S. military base, be welcoming to U.S. military boots on the ground. And even today, he's sort of entertaining this prospect or this notion that a former general, I think his name is Wesley Clark, should become a sort of leader in the defense force or the defense apparatus in Guyana. And so he's been the one that's been mainly entertaining these stupid claims with again stoked or inflamed tensions. But I think that the meeting itself essentially put a hold on that. And so whereas they can both engage in any sort of lofty rhetoric that they want, they cannot threaten or use force given any of that engagement. And I think that that also dampens, those people who may have been cheerleading or wanting to see actual conflict to occur, since the agreement itself says that conflict won't occur and it won't be accepted in the region. Now, when we talk about this notion of zone of peace, again, it's a bit laughable because in the SDG meeting on the 14th, we've seen reports come out afterwards saying that they stress the need for mutual respect and the region standing as a zone of peace. And so the meeting on the 14th was a diplomatic success. However, what I want to note is that you had CARICOM and CELAC members there saying that the region is a zone of peace and it adheres to principles of non-intervention. But you have a lot of members in CARICOM and also in CELAC who are either today championing or either remaining silent when it comes to armed intervention in Haiti. And, if they can note at a meeting on the 14th an intervention and occupation, even when the stated end goal is peace, is anything but, I don't see how they don't see how that's hypocritical of them to stay or stress when they're advocating for armed intervention in Haiti. And so this zone of peace narrative has been a term that's been thrown around for the past month as it regards Venezuela and Guyana, again, given the sort of big holdover of Western intervention. But you don't see them adhering to these same principles in a way that is consistent or fair to states in the region. So again, you see that they advocate for armed intervention in Haiti, and even throughout the region's history, you've seen some states support invasion, even if they'll just leave a meeting talking about the zone of peace. And so I think that the region as a whole needs to be much more politically astute or more educated on what solidarity looks like, what non-intervention means, and what mutual respect means. Because when you use it in sort of fickle ways like this, people can always call out hypocrisy, and I think that we should expect hypocrisy to be called out, especially if it concerns Haiti in this state.